Picking up from our last discussion on violence turned inward, we're now stepping back, way back. We're looking at the big picture of human behavior, trying to understand what makes us tick, or rather, what made our ancestors tick. It's easy to get lost in the specifics of modern conflicts, but the roots run much deeper. The question isn't just about one specific act, but how layers upon layers of cultural evolution, stretching back millions of years, have contributed to it. And crucially, we need to distinguish between the lifestyles that dominate today, pastoralism, agriculture, horticulture, and the reality of most of human history, the hunter-gatherer existence. Think about it. Being a farmer or herder is practically yesterday in evolutionary terms. It's like comparing ancient cave paintings to a smartphone commercial. Let's put some numbers on this. Imagine the entire timeline of humanity as a single day. For almost the entire day, from dawn until maybe late afternoon, humans were living as hunter-gatherers. That's 95%, 98%, maybe even 99% of our time. We're talking small bands, constantly moving, figuring out what berries are safe to eat, and coordinating hunts. So the big question arises, what did violence look like in these societies? What was the baseline for conflict and cooperation during this vast stretch of our past? Now, here's where it gets tricky. Trying to figure out the daily life and interactions of these prehistoric hunter-gatherers is like trying to understand a conversation by only hearing whispers from across a noisy room. They didn't leave behind piles of gold or skyscrapers. Their tools and shelters were often made of materials that decayed long ago. Sure, we have cave paintings, some stunning art showing people hunting mammoths or dancing. But finding a painting that clearly depicts one group attacking another, extremely rare. The fossil record is even more frustratingly silent. Until recently, the only confirmed archaeological site showing an ancient hunter-gatherer massacre was that discovery in northern Kenya, dating back about 10,000 years. One site after all that time. It tells you how difficult it is to get direct evidence. So if the direct evidence is scarce, what do anthropologists do? One powerful approach is comparative analysis. We look at our living primate relatives, especially our closest ones like chimpanzees and bonobos, and try to infer something about our shared ancestors. It's like using a family tree to guess at traits of a great-great-grandfather. Early thinkers like Konrad Lorenz and Robert Ardrey took this approach and ran with it. They argued forcefully that human aggression, particularly territoriality, has deep evolutionary roots, tracing it back to our primate cousins. Ardrey's book, The Territorial Imperative, became a bestseller, suggesting that our violent tendencies are baked into our biology from the start. Then came Richard Wrangham, whose book Demonic Males really shook things up in the late 90s. Wrangham's argument was compelling and controversial. He essentially said that if you want to understand early human violence, you should look at chimpanzees, not hunter-gatherers. He saw a clear link between chimp intergroup aggression and the origins of human warfare. His conclusion was stark. He argued that male aggression wasn't just a minor feature, but the central organizing principle of our ancestors' social lives, shaping everything from their social structures to their technology, and even their minds, for millions of years. It's a very Hobbesian view, painting a picture of constant struggle right from the beginning. Some critics even saw it as dismissive of those who tried to imagine more peaceful, Edenic pasts. But hold on, this chimp blueprint idea faced some serious pushback. First off, whilst chimps are our closest living relatives, we're not them. We've been evolving side by side for millions of years, accumulating differences. Second, critics pointed out that Wrangham sometimes seemed to cherry-pick data. For instance, he highlighted the guerrilla practice of infanticide by rival males as evidence for our violent legacy, but conveniently overlooked that gorillas overall are remarkably non-aggressive compared to other large primates. And here's a big one. What about bonobos? These primates share almost as much DNA with humans as chimps do, yet they are famously less violent, with female-led societies and no real territorial disputes. Ignoring bonobos felt like ignoring half the story. Interestingly, as knowledge about bonobos grew, Wrangham himself later acknowledged the complexity and softened his original stance. Okay, so if we can't rely solely on fossils or primates, where else can we look? For many researchers, the answer is right here today. By studying contemporary hunter-gatherer groups, the few remaining pockets of people who still live lives largely unchanged by modern agriculture and industry, we can gain invaluable insights into the lives of their ancestors. Think of them as living museums, albeit imperfect ones. Groups like the Hadza in Tanzania, the Mbuti in the Congo, the Andaman Islanders, various Inuit cultures, and others offer a window into that long-lost world. Now, studying these groups also helps bust some persistent myths about how hunter-gatherers lived. Take the classic man the hunter image, strong heroic men bringing home the bacon while women just pick berries. Turns out, foraging, gathering nuts, fruits, roots, often provides the bulk of the calories. Men might spend hours bragging about their latest hunt, but the actual success rate can be low. And sometimes the real MVP calorie provider is grandma. Among the Hadza, maternal grandmothers often contribute more food energy than the men do. Then there's the romantic notion that hunter-gatherers were perpetually starving, scraping by just before agriculture saved them. Nope. Studies show they typically worked fewer hours than farmers, enjoyed better health, and lived longer. As anthropologist Marshall Salins famously put it, they were the original affluent society, not quite starving to death every other day. Looking at these contemporary groups reveals some common patterns in how they organize themselves demographically. There used to be a strong belief that hunter-gatherer bands were tightly knit families with lots of genetic relatedness. But newer research suggests more fluidity, especially among nomadic groups. Bands might merge temporarily or split apart as resources dictate. This fusion-fission dynamic means group membership isn't always fixed. An interesting consequence of this fluidity, observed among the Hadza, is that particularly successful cooperative hunters tend to find each other and form lasting partnerships. It's like finding your tribe based on shared skills and success, not just blood ties. So, what about violence? For decades, the dominant narrative, especially fueled by studies of groups like the Kalahari, Kung San, described in Elizabeth Marshall Thomas's famous book, The Harmless People, was that hunter-gatherers were fundamentally peaceful, cooperative, and egalitarian. The idea was that if things got too tense within a group, someone would just leave. If groups clashed, they'd just move to different areas. It was a very Rousseau-like view, painting hunter-gatherers as noble savages. However, this picture started to crumble as researchers conducted longer, more intensive fieldwork. They began documenting killings, homicides, sometimes even seeming like warfare. Suddenly, comparing hunter-gatherer murder rates to cities like Detroit wasn't so shocking anymore. This shift was seen by some as a necessary correction, a return to objective observation after what some called the Romanticism of the 60s. By the time Steven Pinker synthesized these findings, the consensus leaned towards acknowledging significant levels of violence, averaging perhaps 15% of deaths due to warfare, lending credence to a more Hobbesian interpretation of human history. But wait, the counter-argument emerged. Was it really that simple? Critics pointed out several issues with equating all hunter-gatherers with high levels of violence. First, mislabeling. Some groups studied weren't purely hunter-gatherers but practiced some horticulture. Second, misinterpretation. Many incidents labeled as warfare were actually just isolated homicides, not organized battles between groups. Third, anachronism. Some violent groups, like certain Plains Native Americans, had access to horses, which didn't exist during the Pleistocene era relevant to our ancestors. Fourth, context matters. Contemporary hunter-gatherers often live under immense pressure from encroaching agriculturalists, resource depletion, and contact with outsiders, conditions vastly different from their ancestors. Fifth, cherry-picking again. The focus often highlighted violent episodes while ignoring numerous examples of peaceful hunter-gatherer societies. And finally, a crucial distinction. Not all hunter-gatherers are created equal. There's a difference between nomadic hunter-gatherers and complex hunter-gatherers. What are these complex hunter-gatherers? Think of them as a transitional type. They're hunter-gatherers, yes, but they're often sedentary, staying in one place, usually because they have access to a rich, reliable food source, maybe a good fishing spot or an area with abundant game. Because they're defending this valuable territory and resources, they tend to be more hierarchical, less egalitarian, and significantly more prone to violence than their nomadic counterparts. This brings us back to that archaeological site in Kenya, Nadaruk. Those skeletons killed around 10,000 years ago belonged to sedentary hunter-gatherers living near Lake Turkana. That's prime real estate, easy fishing, lots of animals coming to drink. Exactly the kind of place where conflict over resources could easily escalate into massacre. Nadaruk fits perfectly into this complex HE profile. So, given all this complexity, what do the most careful analyses tell us? Researchers like David P. Fry and Patrick Soderberg tried to cut through the noise. In a landmark 2013 study, they meticulously reviewed reports of lethal violence in 21 well-documented, relatively isolated nomadic hunter-gatherer groups, groups studied before major outside contact disrupted them. Their definition of warfare was pretty broad, just conflict resulting in multiple casualties. What did they find? Warfare in that sense was observed in only a minority of these cultures. It wasn't widespread across the board. However, that doesn't mean these groups were pacifist utopias. Lethal violence, even if not always organized warfare, occurred in a whopping 86% of these cultures. So it was definitely not unheard of either. Christopher Boehm, in his book Moral Origins, took a similar approach, surveying a slightly larger set of around 50 nomadic hunter-gatherer cultures. Again, mostly men commit the violence. What are the triggers? Often, it boils down to disputes involving women, maybe two men fighting over a woman, or attempts to abduct a woman from a neighboring group. Adultery accusations frequently lead to spousal homicide. There's also female infanticide, killings based on witchcraft accusations, disputes over stolen food or refusals to share, and of course revenge killings. Crucially, Boehm notes that both he and Fry found evidence of killings that function like capital punishment, targeting individuals who've committed severe violations of core social norms, things like murder, trying to seize power, practicing harmful sorcery, stealing, betraying the group, or breaking major taboos. These aren't random acts. They seem to be responses to serious norm breaches. So, what are these core norms that when violated can lead to such drastic measures? Boehm identifies three key pillars of nomadic hunter-gatherer societies. First, fairness. Remember how they pioneered cooperative hunting and sharing? This requires strict adherence to fair play, especially when dividing up the spoils. Meat is often shared widely, including with unsuccessful hunters, and crucially, the most successful hunter rarely gets to decide the distribution. It's typically handled by a neutral third party. Even tiny perceived unfairness, like getting slightly less meat than someone else, becomes a constant background hum of social regulation. Second, indirect reciprocity. This is different from simple tit for tat. It's more like paying kindness forward. If person A helps person B, B's obligation isn't necessarily to help A back, but to help someone else C. This creates a web of trust essential for cooperation, especially in big game hunting where individual hunts often fail, but successful hunts yield huge surpluses. As the saying goes, the best investment against future hunger is putting meat in other people's stomachs now. Third, avoidance of despotism. There's always a risk of someone trying to bully their way to the top. Hunter-gatherers are constantly vigilant, policing overt displays of power-grabbing and intimidation. How do these societies enforce these critical norms? Enter gossip. Yes, gossip. Far from being trivial chatter, anthropologists like Polly Wiesner have shown that hunter-gatherer gossip is a powerful tool for social control. It's like People magazine, but around the campfire. Most of it focuses on norm violations, especially by individuals who hold high status or prestige. Why? Gossip serves multiple functions. It helps reality test situations. Is it really true that he was unfair? It disseminates important news. Remember when X got blamed for the bad luck during the hunt? And crucially, it builds consensus. Something needs to be done about this guy. Once gossip raises awareness, collective action follows. Criticism, shaming, mockery, ostracism, refusing to share meat, non-lethal punishment, expulsion, or as a last resort, execution. It's a remarkably effective system for maintaining social order without needing formal institutions. So after wading through all this data, where does that leave us? Are we back to Hobbes, living in a state of nature full of conflict? Or Rousseau depicting peaceful, noble savages? The answer, frustratingly, is probably neither. It's a messy mix. The key is making careful distinctions. We need to differentiate between hunter-gatherers and other traditional lifestyles, between nomadic and sedentary hunter-gatherers, between broad surveys and studies focusing on extreme cases, between internal disputes and external threats, between viewing chimps as cousins versus ancestors, and remembering the crucial role of bonobos. We also need to distinguish between warfare and simple homicide, and between contemporary hunter-gatherers living in stable environments versus those pushed to the margins by outsiders. Once we make these distinctions, a clearer picture emerges. The nomadic hunter-gatherers who populated the earth for hundreds of thousands of years were likely capable of murder, certainly. But organized, large-scale war in the way we understand it today, or even in its most basic ancestral form, seems to have been relatively rare until humans largely abandoned the nomadic lifestyle. Our species' history, it seems, wasn't necessarily soaked in escalating conflict. This leads us to a provocative idea presented in the text. Perhaps the invention of agriculture was, in fact, one of humanity's biggest blunders. Think New Coke or the Edsel, a well-intentioned innovation that backfired spectacularly. Why this negativity towards farming? Well, consider the downsides. Agriculture makes us dependent on a handful of crops and animals, making us incredibly vulnerable to drought, blight, or disease outbreaks that could wipe out entire food supplies. It forces sedentism, leading to living conditions like close proximity to waste that would baffle any hygienic primate. And crucially, agriculture creates surplus. Surplus inevitably leads to inequality, as some people hoard more than others, creating social hierarchies far more pronounced than anything typically seen in other primates. From there, it's a short hop, skip, and jump to organized conflict over resources, land, and status. Perhaps, just perhaps, agriculture didn't just feed us. It set the stage for letting loose the dogs of war. This brings us to a fascinating aspect of human evolution, the coevolution of brains and culture. It's a feedback loop. Our biological brains shape the cultures we create, and those cultures, in turn, shape our brains and behaviors. While there's some evidence that genetic differences between populations influence behavior, the impact is likely quite small. Much more consequential is childhood, the critical period when cultures imprint themselves onto individuals, ensuring the next generation continues the cultural tradition. A key biological factor enabling this is the remarkable plasticity of the human frontal cortex, especially during development. Unlike other brain regions, it's genetically programmed to be highly malleable, absorbing environmental influences and cultural norms. This allows us to learn incredibly complex rules, like when it's culturally acceptable to throw a punch, something a simpler reflex might not handle. This cultural shaping manifests in profound ways. We see differences in what's considered permissible or taboo, whom it's okay to kill, an enemy soldier, a cheating spouse, an elderly parent, a newborn of the wrong sex, reflecting deep cultural values. But sometimes, these differences pop up in surprisingly subtle places, like micro-expressions in your eyes when you see certain images, or whether thinking of a rabbit makes you think of other animals or what rabbits eat. Ecology plays a massive role in shaping culture, influencing subsistence strategies, social organization, and beliefs. Yet, there's a paradox. Once a culture takes hold, it can persist and spread remarkably well, even into radically different environments. Think about it. Most of the world's humans today inherit their fundamental beliefs about life, death, and everything in between from pre-literate Middle Eastern pastoralist cultures. Culture has a powerful inertia. All right, we've talked about hunter-gatherers, violence, and the rise of agriculture. But to really understand the deep roots of human behavior, we need to go back to the absolute foundation, evolution. As the geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky famously said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. This includes understanding human behavior. Evolution operates through a simple yet powerful three-step process. First, traits are inherited genetically. Second, mutations and recombination create variation in those traits. Third, some variants confer greater fitness, meaning they help organisms survive and reproduce more effectively. Over generations, the frequency of these advantageous variants increases in the population. Our goal now is to apply this framework specifically to the evolution of behavior. Before we dive deeper, let's quickly dispense with some common misconceptions about evolution, because they can cloud our thinking. First, it's not about survival of the fittest. It's about reproduction of the fittest. An organism can live a long life but never reproduce, and it won't leave any offspring carrying its genes. Evolution cares about passing genes on. This is shown by antagonistic pleiotropy, traits that boost early reproduction but shorten lifespan, like the prostate gland in primates or the epic spawning migration of salmon. Second, evolution doesn't select for pre-adaptations, traits that are neutral now but useful later. Selection acts on traits relevant to the present environment. Relatedly, living species aren't inherently better adapted than extinct ones. They were just adapted to their specific times and places. Third, evolution doesn't have a built-in drive towards complexity. Bacteria are simple, yet incredibly successful. Finally, the claim that evolution is just a theory is misleading. Like germ theory or gravity, it's a robust scientific theory supported by mountains of evidence. From antibiotic resistance happening right now to the fossil record, molecular genetics, geographic distributions, and even weird anatomical leftovers like whale leg bones. Evolution shapes behavior through two main types of selection. Sexual selection favors traits that increase an individual's attractiveness to mates. Think bright feathers, elaborate songs, or impressive antlers. Natural selection, on the other hand, favors traits that enhance general survival and reproductive success through any means, like good health, efficient foraging skills, or avoiding predators. These two processes don't always agree. Large horns might help a male sheep dominate rivals and attract mates, but they are metabolically expensive and can be a liability. Peacock plumage is dazzling to females but costly to grow and hinders escape from predators. Sometimes neither process selects for a single best version of a trait. Instead, frequency-dependent selection might favor the rarer trait, or balanced selection might maintain multiple versions in equilibrium within a population. We see amazing adaptations everywhere. Desert rodents with water-retaining kidneys, giraffes with hearts strong enough to pump blood to their brains, elephants with legs built for immense weight. It makes sense, right? Traits that don't work get eliminated through natural selection. The same logic applies to behavior. Just as natural selection sculpts anatomy and physiology into optimal forms, it also sculpts behavior into adaptive strategies. Various fields study this, notably sociobiology, which emerged in the 70s, arguing that social behaviors are shaped by evolution to be optimized, much like a giraffe's heart size. It's an offshoot called evolutionary psychology, focusing on the evolutionary optimization of psychological traits. Both fields have generated plenty of heat and light, and plenty of controversy, but they represent attempts to understand how our evolutionary past might shape our present behaviors. So, wrapping up this section, we've journeyed from the complexities of contemporary hunter-gatherer life, through the challenges of interpreting the past, to the potential game-changing impact of agriculture, and finally touched upon the fundamental evolutionary principles that underpin all of this. Understanding this intricate tapestry of history and biology is absolutely essential as we prepare to tackle the next big question. Has humanity actually become less violent over time? That's where we're headed next.